This is a new workbench I've built, and it set itself apart from other workbenches like this you may have already seen, because it has one special feature. Of course, there are the usual features like storage space with drawers, for example, and a door. And it's really easy to build. In fact, all the tools you really need are a circular saw and a router with a jig and a drill. But I only have 2 hands. Now the special feature is that this is fully disassemblable. And you may ask, why is this useful? It is especially useful when you know that you move someday. I for me know that I will eventually have to leave this workshop and set up a new one somewhere else. And now taking this workbench with me when it's mostly flat pieces is a lot simpler than a big, heavy, fully assembled workbench. Setting it up again is done in about 15 minutes, and then it is a pretty nice beginning of a new workshop with lots of storage space already included. Wanna know the best part? I have plans available for this, but not only that, in the plans I'll cover making the workbench in the size I need it, but there's also a configurator where you can input the size of workbench you need, and it outputs measurements and instructions to build your custom workbench. Pretty cool. But now let's go a few weeks back in time and I show you everything it took to build this. I've never really shown this space or workbench in my videos because, obviously, it's what I call a corner of shame in my workshop, where I throw all kinds of random junk under there and forget about it. And over time it adds up to this. Now I finally want to get rid of that by building a new workbench and then, I guess, finding a new corner of shame in my workshop. There are plenty of options, maybe over there. So let's go. As much as I would like to use some nice hardwood for this project, I have some old lumber that used to be a shelf of my sister's she no longer needs. And it's quite a lot of good lumber. I need to remove a few metal parts before I can really use that. Now, according to my little cut list, I've chosen all the pieces and I actually only need this much. Next comes milling the pieces to thickness to 3 times the thickness of the panels I'm using. In my case, 12 millimeters or about ½ inch. So this needs to be 36 millimeters or 1½ inches. Of course, in the beginning I said you only need a saw and a router to build this bench. That I was assuming you buy new lumber with the correct thickness to begin with. Since I'm using used lumber, I just have to get it to thickness with my jointer planer. But also, using 3 times the panel thickness is no necessity. It only makes installing the drawer slides later a bit easier. Something I haven't done in a really long time is a video edit that matches the beat of the music. It was quite enjoyable doing that again and I hope you like it too. Basically what I'm doing here is cutting the pieces of shelf into 2x4s or basically more dimensional lumber that you could also buy with similar dimensions. Cutting parts to length with the table saw is the simplest, but a jig for the circular saw works just fine. The jig are 2 pieces of wood at a 90-degree angle glued together, and I also had to use it for the long rails. Got all my pieces cut to size. Next is to glue the leg parts together. I don't want to wait for the glue to dry. Let's wait faster. Would you look at that? The glue is dry. I then jointed the remaining glue away and cut to final dimensions. Starting with square lumber or just screwing the leg parts together would also work. Okay, all parts are prepared. Next comes cutting the mortise and tenon joinery. And all the tools you need for that is a router with a very simple jig and 1 single straight bit. A bit like this works perfectly, but mine is pretty dull already. And I have this relatively new spiral bit. It does the same thing. The jig is basically a piece of plexiglass screwed to the underside of the router base with 2 pieces of plywood that act as adjustable fences. There are slots where the fences move in and knobs to clamp them secure. I also have a whole video about making this jig, which maybe is intimidating because I cut this shape out with the CNC router, but then I also made an update video where I showed how you can just make the same thing with the router table. And I've linked both of these videos in the video description. First part of the joinery is cutting mortises for the tenons and slots for the panels. Like with many tasks, preparation can prevent you from screwing up later, so I'm marking the orientation on all legs and the position of all slots and mortises on the parts directly.
Since I don't have one, I made a crappy big vise.
Both fences are loose and I plunge now to the surface roughly at the center. Then I make both fences touching the edge and screw them secure. And with the bit raised again, I make sure that it can move freely without binding. And if it does, I unscrew one of the fences, make that tight here again, and try again. Then I set the depth of cut to the thickness of the panels I'm using, in my case 12 millimeters.
And with that setting I make the first cut. The spiral bit I'm using can be punched to full depth at once. Normal bits need to be moved while plunging, but they can also cut full depth once they are plunged. And as you can see, my crappy vise works beautifully. Then you turn the part around and cut from the other side. That way the slot ends up in the perfect center.
The slot after the first pass is intentionally too small, but now adjusting the jig to make it bigger is a lot simpler than trying to make a too big slot small again. The bit is now set again to roughly the surface, and now I can loosen the back fence, adjust the whole jig to cut a little bit more, and then retighten the fence at this new position. I also have the front fence now a bit loose because I only use the back fence as the guide, and the front fence will just prevent from moving too far back.
With the second setting I again cut from both sides.
Second pass is done, it almost fits, I only need one more tiny adjustment. And now that fits. With the jig now set up, I can cut the next slot in only one pass.
One pass, but of course from both sides again. This is also the procedure as a sped up one take, so you can see it actually works and is rather simple and quick once set up. Next I mark the start and stop locations for the mortises and transfer them to all the other pieces. The jig setting is exactly the same as before, but I'm plunging deeper.
Now with all the slots and mortises and the leg pieces done, it's basically the same procedure with all the other pieces. Only difference is that the slots here go all the way through.
And since these pieces have a different thickness, you have to go through the setup procedure again. If you have, you can also use the router table or the table saw for these pieces, but I felt much safer with the handheld router than with the router table. And be prepared, cutting all this joinery makes a mess.
Alright, next... Next cutting the tenons. I'm still using the same bit, but I switched the two fences for a taller one. Then I've marked the tenon length and set the bit right to that line. And I moved the fence against the wooden edge. My starting depth is about 10 millimeters.
And with this jig setting, you then nibble away the material while using the end of the workpiece as a guide for the fence of the jig. Only the last cut is important. There you have to make sure not to lose contact with the jig fence, but otherwise you just have to repeat that last cut. Then again turning the piece around to cut from the other side. This view also shows better what's going on during the cuts. And as you can see, the resulting tenon then also ends up centered.
I again started too big on purpose and now can fine adjust to cut a bit deeper.
Cutting deeper will make the tenon thinner.
And after one more adjustment, I got a pretty good fit.
To finish the tenon, you then do the cuts on the edge of the pieces.
What I also like to do, since the router on this edge is quite tippy, only cut away the bulk of the material here and cut the rest of the shoulder with the chisel. And there's the first finished tenon. Because of the way the joinery is done centered, these slots line up perfectly. Now I just have to do it a few more times. These two front pieces in the middle are the only ones that don't have a center tenon. They also need to be cut in the edge, and to prevent the router from tipping that much, I cut both of them at the same time. So I align them, clamp them together, but the jig setting can stay the same as before.
For me this works for one side. Unfortunately my fence is not tall enough for the other side. To keep the jig setting though, I temporarily clamp another piece to the fence and make it thick enough for the second cut. And here you can see the clamped on piece guiding the jig. The cut depth I then just set to get a tenon that's as thick as all the others.
Cutting the shoulders on these pieces was basically the same as before, just not as deep. I didn't film that again. These two pieces will now join into mortises in the front rails that I cut next. And I need to cut them in a way so the spacing in between here is the same. To get the spacing, I first align the two pieces at one end, and then I measure the distance from these two pieces to the other end. about 1 meter 22 and a half or 0.6. Divide it by 3 with a calculator or do it in your head. About 40.9. Now I've cut spacer pieces out of scrap material to that length and can put them in between here and see if everything lines up. I'm flush on this side and on the other side not quite. I need to cut them a little shorter. Now it's flush on both sides.
I clamped the spacers in place and marked the location of the pieces.
This is where the edge of the pieces will be, but I want the mortise to stop a few millimeters before that.
The procedure for these mortises is the same as before, but this time I have to make them fit the existing tenons, similar to making the slots fit the panels.
And that's already all the wooden joinery, so let's do a dry assembly.
Now here it's too bad that you can't see my whole face or hear my thoughts during that, but I'll try to comment. So, brain's thinking, and brain's confused, brain's testing, and realizes it totally screwed up.
Something's wrong.
Good conclusion, you smartass. And I guess biting that lip won't help either.
It obviously looks like I screwed up this length. I've checked with the 3D model again and I made the legs too long. They should be 700 millimeters long, and when I measured them, I apparently included a tabletop. At least that's a relatively easy fix. And fixed, although the tenons are now open on this end, but doesn't really matter.
It does matter. It turned out to be a very handy feature, but more on that later during the glue up. Now let's do that dry assembly again.
That looks good so far, and if I didn't have another screw up, this should fit right in between here. Looks good. As you can see, every tenon joint has lots of tolerance, and that's on purpose because cutting the tenon just perfect so everything ends up flush is quite difficult, and like that you can do it when gluing it together. It's much easier. But you can't really adjust the spacing of the front rails because that's determined by the length of these pieces. So with them being flush on the bottom, that can end up with them not being flush on the top, like it happened to me. To fix that, you could tweak the length of these pieces or just make sure that the side with the tabletop is flush. The size of the back panel is the inner distance of the 2 rails plus 2 times the depth of the grooves or 2 times the panel thickness minus 1 or 2 millimeters to give room for some glue. Same for the other direction. The back panel itself could be anything: particle board, OSB, MDF. Since I only have plywood on hand, I'm using that.
One last thing I did mostly off camera is rounding over the edges of most pieces and sanding away the pencil marks from before. Link to this handy router table accessory is also in the description.
The dry assembly with the back panel worked and looks good, but the glue up will still be a little challenging. To make it as simple as possible, I first glue in the panel into one rail. This rail is pretty bent, difficult to see, but this shows it clearly. So I slightly clamp it down to something straight, and while it's clamped straight, I glue in the panel. It's also very important to spread the glue to the sides of the groove. Make sure the spacing is equal on the sides. To get the vertical orientation right, I put the top rail on top and clamp it to a leg. I let this dry for a while, and then the panel and the big glue joint will keep this rail straight. The glue is dry and now the rail stays straight.
Next, some glue to the legs and tenons. I place the upper rail on top of the legs, which ensures the right spacing while I clamp everything together with a band clamp. Once clamped together, I can check for square and make adjustments if necessary. With the glue set after about 15 minutes, I can glue the upper rail in place.
My screw up from before now turns out to be a very handy feature because the mortise is now open and I can insert the whole rail from above and can do that as a separate step, and that's much simpler. Seeing how well this screw up worked for the glue up, I would now begin with such a joint and make this tenon flush with the leg. Even though this still gets clamped and the glue is not dry, I can already go on. I grab 2 of the spacers I made previously, put them on top and bottom, and that aligns this piece. Same on this side.
The procedure is then the same for the front frame, except there's no panel.
For the middle parts I again used the spacers, but I raised them up with some scrap wood to keep them away from the glue squeeze out. The middle spacer I can kind of jam in between here. But I take it out again to check for square. That needed some adjusting. This as well. You could use clamps, but you don't really need them. Just make sure that the joint is fully seated. With the back and front frame done, I can assemble them with the side pieces.
And measuring the panel size again. Here I also chamfered the edges slightly, which makes inserting them into the slots easier, especially with glue. Dry assembled, I can check everything for square and dry fit all panels. They just slide in place.
These slots really turn out to be so useful. I'm definitely going to change the design to this. This looks good. I think I can glue the panels in place. Of course, only in the lower and upper part. I've moved the band clamp up a little, which should fold the two frames together, and that makes installing the upper parts a little easier because there's a little bit of pre-tension. And then just knock it down like you really want to get into a door. Ow. And make it flush. With the second side glued as well, I put the band clamp up to apply proper tension.
And lastly, the middle pieces.
After the glue dried, I could release the tension and take it apart again. But to add the screws, I'll leave it clamped together. To hold everything together and make it disassemblable, I'll be using these washer head screws that will just screw directly into the wood.
With a force niblet, I drill a little into the parts to sink the screw heads below the surface. And on the sides where the screw will go through the tenon, I also pre-drill to avoid splitting the wood.
Oops. On the top side, I also make sure that before pre-drilling or screwing that everything lines up flush. With all the screws installed now, this is a pretty solid brick. Next come the leveling feet.
I have a whole video about making them, so here I only quickly show their installation.
So far so good. Next comes the tabletop. But it's still buried underneath all this, so I guess it's finally time to clean all this up.
What comes out of there is kind of funny and interesting.
Two pieces of hose I guess I wanted to use for something. I have no idea how long these rags are already down there. My first homemade impeller. I have no idea why I still have that. I will never use this again. Time to throw it out. Tons of rubber bands that I use, but finally they won't sit on the floor in these bags anymore. This was a prototype for my drum sander that I built about 6 years ago. Why do I still have that? A big motor, another motor, another motor, another motor. On top it doesn't look too bad, but down here that's a disaster. And if you wonder why I put all this stuff, basically everywhere.
After a quick snap cleaning, I can get the tabletop off.
I put the workbench frame upside down onto the top, centered it out, and I'll connect the two parts with these rails. All these parts will stay attached to the top, and I also rounded over all edges on the top here. So now when I'm setting this workbench up somewhere, I don't have to care about alignment of the tabletop, because all these pieces will index it and align it automatically. Thanks to the roundover, it will just drop in place. I don't have to search for any screw holes, just can screw it down now on the parts.
Another big advantage of this workbench design is applying a finish, because you can take everything apart and finish smaller parts that you can lay flat on the table. After 2 coats of finish cured, I recorded the whole assembly again, and it took about 12 minutes to do the whole thing. Then it's also a good idea to mark which subassemblies go where.
The basic bench is now done. Next comes my customization of the interior. Originally I wanted to have 10 drawers in these 2 spots, but I don't really know what I would put in there. And with 10 they would be relatively small. Going with the thinking that I take this bench with me when I have to leave this workshop, I would also take all my handheld power tools with me, so it makes sense to put most of them in there. And this spot back here will be for rarely used stuff that I have really bad access at the moment. To easier decide which tools go in which drawer and how high they need to be, I drew the drawer inner dimensions on this plate here and can now just put random tools on there and sort through the best options.
Once I had figured out all the drawer dimensions, I started cutting some 12mm plywood to build them. I'm trying something new for their construction, which is using a special router bit. The benefit is that I can cut the whole joinery all at once to a bigger piece and then cut the pieces into strips, which make up the drawer sides. With all the pieces cut to size, I next cut a rabbet for the drawer bottom.
After all that routing, I can assemble it into a box.
Gluing and clamping is also simple because you can just slide the pieces against each other to spread the glue and you only need 2 clamps. I also made a video about setting up the router bit if you're interested about more details on how that's done.
Unfortunately, not all drawers came out nice and square at every corner, and I think that came from cutting the joinery here and the pieces slightly lifting up while I was routing them. I can't change that now, but I hope that with the bottom that I can cut perfectly square, I can kind of force the rest of the drawer also into square. I also didn't quite have enough plywood for the bottoms, so for 2 of the drawers I glued 2 pieces of cheap laminate flooring that I had laying around together, and that also makes for a good drawer bottom.
I attached the drawer bottom with glue and screws, which saves waiting for the glue to dry. For the laminate flooring I only use glue.
Next is installing the full extension drawer slides. They're not the cheapest option for workshop drawers, but very worth it, and I'm very thankful that they are given to me by you, my viewers, quite a while ago through my Amazon wishlist. Thanks again for that. Installing them can sometimes be quite a hassle, but this time I think I have a method that makes it just simple. Remember how I made the frame pieces 3 times the thickness as the panels? Now it gets really useful because instead of installing the slides individually to the panel, I can screw all of them to some more panel material before and then install all of them at the same time, and that will make them flush automatically with the frame. Figuring out the hole positions on these strips is also pretty simple. I just stand the slide upright and measure the distance to the hole, and I add a little bit of thickness so there's some clearance and the drawer won't end up rubbing. And in my case that's about 27mm. The spacing of the next slide just depends on how tall you want your drawer to be, and then it's just that first spacing plus the height of your drawer. In my case, I want this to be 180mm, so I add this to 27, and that's 207, and I make another mark. Finally, I mark down the center, and I have all my hole positions. For the part on the drawer, I slide it out a little to get access to the slots, put that next to it, and make a mark. Then I slide it out further for the next one and then take it apart for the last one.
The outer part of the slides can just be screwed into the pre-drilled holes.
I then drilled some mounting holes and now can install this whole frame. I have a piece the thickness of the drawer fronts I'm using. I just make that flush with the front and then let the frame butt up against the bottom and the top, and then everything is straight. This method of course also works if the frame pieces are not 3 times as thick as the panel. Then you just need to cut the strips to the correct thickness so it ends up flush. Now comes the moment of, did I screw up or not? Looks good.
Let's just ignore that.
I've now prepared blanks for the drawer fronts, and it's phenolic resin coated plywood. And if you watch my channel for a little longer, you know that this is basically the stuff that I used on any other shop drawer I made so far.
I cut them a bit too tall first and just screwed them to the boxes with the same spaces as before to lift the boxes slightly up and give some clearance.
Now starting with the first drawer, it intentionally won't fit. And I will now trim cut the front while it's installed until it's a perfect fit. Then I repeat the same with the next drawers.
The door is just fastened with a piano hinge. I then also added a bottom and magnetic latches to keep the door shut. Drawer handles I usually make myself to save some money. I make this shape with 3 angled cuts on the table saw and round over the edges with a hand plane. And then they look like this and can just be screwed to the drawer front.
And that's it. It's finished. Great new home for all my handheld power tools. I like that arrangement. It's not fully loaded, but I'll do the rest off camera. Now, if you want to build your own version of this workbench, follow the link in the video description and that will take you to the plans, and then you can build this yourself. If you like this video and would like to support me with making them, head over to my Patreon, which is also linked in the description. And there I also post more project updates, behind the scenes content, early access to my videos and also ad-free versions of them. Pretty cool, so check that out. And then I guess I'll see you for the next project. Last thing, I have one great outtake for this video, which basically wasn't an outtake because it was included in the video, the little special effect with the saw in the beginning. But making that and editing that turned out to be so hilarious, I wanted to show you the whole thing, so here it is. And it's really easy to build. In fact, all the tools you really need are a circular saw, and a router. With a jig. And a drill. But I only have 2 hands.